Hello, everyone. I'm Sorrel Souffle. Hi. I think ships are very cool. I've been a fan of them for quite some time now. Um, Very rarely I stream things on Twitch. Like I've maybe done that 5 times this year. It's I don't know. It takes a while to do that. Um, my little streaming character is in the corner there, the one on the right, not the one on the left. Um, did you know that I like ships? I got into naval history after I watched the anime Arpeggio of Blue Steel in middle school. After I saw a YouTube video of like this teddy bear like kicking a soldier in the head, and I said, "Oh, that seems interesting." And then I got one-shotted by ships being in the show. Um, so I was like, "These are really cool. I should pivot my entire life to learn more about these." And then I did that. Um, I was gonna do dinosaurs, but then I said history instead. Um, but also that put me into the position where now I'm on the stage talking about ships for an hour. Yippee! Um, so this is a panel about fake ships. For the most part, it gets complicated. We'll get to that in World of Warships. Um, I've been playing this game on and off for like as long as it's been out. Probably, I couldn't tell you when I started playing, but it was probably like 2014 or something. On and off. Last few months I've been playing a lot because there's a Christmas they give away free stuff. It's nice. Um, in the lower middle of my screen here, you'll see a picture of USS Hull, which is the one historical ship that makes an appearance in this panel. It gets weird. We're gonna get to that. It'll take a little while. Um, our objective at this panel is to analyze a small selection of ahistorical and made-up ships in the game and evaluate if they're physically possible, and to a lesser extent, whether they make sense historically where it's applicable. There's a lot of minorly technical stuff that'll be talked about, so you may be interested in taking photos of the slides or perhaps in writing down some notes if you're fast enough. I have a handful of semi-related book recommendations at the end, and you can like at me on Twitter or something if you have any questions about anything I covered, and I'll try to answer them. That'll be at the end too. But I mean, if you search Sorrel Souffle, you should be able to find it. Hopefully, I hope. Um, so what is World of War? What is World of Warships? World of Warships is a very arcadey and not especially historical take on naval warfare in the first half of the 20th century. Two teams are match made and must win by destroying the enemy team or reaching a point goal. Ships range from very accurately reproduced historical ships to never built ships based on real designs to entirely fictitious ships dreamt up by the developers. There's also ships and skins for ships based off of collabs with animes, Star Trek The Next Generation, and Heroes of Might and Magic 3, and all sorts of other things. Uh, at the moment, there's over 600 ships in the game. They're assigned to a tier system of 1 to 10, which is more or less based on how large or technologically developed they are, and is for a gameplay purpose, for matchmaking. The abbreviated version of World of Warships is WOWs, and I might use that sometimes so I don't say an extra 2 words. The developer of World of Warships is Wargaming, who have also made World of Tanks. I'm not sure if that's more popular or less popular than World of Warships. Their new game, Steel Hunters, I believe, is coming out soon. I think they just had an open beta. It was at the Game Awards. They did a trailer for it. They also made World of Warplanes. World of Warships makes heavy use of loot boxes and has a bunch of monetization features that you don't have to interact at all. It's kind of silly to like see when you're playing the game though. Um, I don't know if it's like on the level of FIFA or anything though. I haven't played any of those, but I've heard it's crazy over there too. There's also a mobile version of the game that's also on Xbox. It's different that I haven't played. What is a warship? A warship is any ship or boat which is used by a navy in a combat role. Um, World of Warship World of Warships features warships from the 1890s through 1950s, though the vast majority of the ships in the game are meant to be from the 1930s and 40s. There's 5 categories of ships in World of Warships. Those ships in them are not always given their historical classification. As an example, there are a number of fast, unarmored light cruisers in the top tier that are classified as destroyers for gameplay and matchmaking reasons. Battleships are large, heavily armored, and heavily armed ships that can deal heavy damage in the game, but aren't very maneuverable. Most ships that would be classified as battle cruisers, which are less armored, faster variants of battleships, are also in this category in-game. Cruisers are medium-sized ships that perform a wide variety of roles in the game, and in real life. Those with lighter armament are called light cruisers, and those with heavier armament are called heavy cruisers. World of Warships also considers the large cruiser type ships that thread the line between cruisers and battleships, such as the Alaska class, to be cruisers for gameplay purposes. Aircraft carriers carry aircraft, and they have a big flat deck on top that planes land and take off from. And submarines are boats that go underwater. Destroyers are very light, fast ships meant to use torpedoes and act as the front line for the fleet, as well as engage with submarines using depth charges. Much like cruisers, they serve a number of roles in real life and in the game. And I will note here that a ship and a boat are not the same thing. The ship carries boats, but a boat does not carry boats. That's what the difference is. It's like rectangle and a square. If you know, you know. So here we get to Spring Sharp. There's a lot of stuff here. I hope it's readable at scale. Oh, that's what the arrows point to. Okay. Spring Sharp is a program based on the actual formulas and preliminary planning books used by the old U.S. naval bureaus. There used to be a bunch of different like sub-departments within the Navy: ordnance, ships, construction and repair. Over time, they got merged, and then they all became NAVC, which is over in D.C. now. But at the time that all the stuff from this game is set with, for the U.S. Navy at least, there's bureaus here. I think the things at the bottom is from the Bureau of Ships, I think. But unlike what they used back in the day, this program does all the stuff automatically, so you don't have to do any math in your head unless you want to. So it's a very useful tool to mess around with, to design ships with for fun, or whatever other reason you have to simulate warships that were designed between 1850 and 1950 that isn't fun. If you have one of those, which would be crazy. Due to the way that the formulas work, Spring Sharp is kind of awkward with really old ships. Like, you can't possibly have USS Monitor simulated in there. That's from the 1860s. And expect it to work in the program. Generally speaking, the closer you get to 1950, the better it works. Spring Sharp's name comes from Spring Styles, which was the name for the book that these designs at the bottom came from, which are preliminary planning blueprint documents that the Navy made ahead of like actually doing the in-detail designing of ships, which is the thing that Spring Sharp is meant to do. You can find everything from catalogs 1 and 3 online if you search Spring Styles ships on Google. Spring Styles is named after women's fashion catalogs that were called Spring Styles because ships are ladies. The ship at the bottom is a preliminary design for what would have become the South Dakota class that was scrapped in the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. And the numbers at the bottom are for it. The functional purpose of Spring Sharp is to input numerical characteristics of ships, such as their dimensions, armament, amount of armor, and size, and all sorts of literally everything, until you get what is called a composite strength of 1.00, which represents that the ship can, if you didn't do anything silly, it can have all the stuff that you put on it work and probably float. Beyond that, you could have done something really weird, and obviously it wouldn't work in real life. You can make your ship too wide and not long enough. That doesn't work at all. But it could still print out a number of 1. So above that number, if you get 1.10, you have too little. If you stuff on your ship, if you're at 0.9, you have too much. You can fix this by removing stuff or putting stuff on the ship, or by making the ship larger or smaller. If you're a twisted freak like me, it can be a lot of fun to mess around with and lose track of time in. I used to take part in a bunch of competitions with nerds on the internet designing ships based off of like prompts like they would historically. If you have enough naval nerds in your friend group, I would highly recommend it. The real big downside of Spring Sharp is that it's has a really slow development. It's developed by like 2 guys in Australia, and they've gotten one update in 10 years. Um, One of the most important things in the program is not implemented, which is engine factor. There's a slider on the top right of the image that has that, and it's a slider that would, if it worked, which it doesn't, allow you to select if your engine is more high-speed geared and economical, or like big and bulky. It's by default, it's set to big and bulky. So everything has really heavy engines, which is a problem, that are also large, which is a problem when you're trying to make a small, fast ship. So they don't work very well in Spring Sharp because of that. It's also not possible to simulate a submarine at all because they have pressure vessels, and that's not something that this is equipped to handle. And aircraft carriers have a lot of like kind of miscellaneous weight that's really hard to simulate in a way that's accurate and quantifiable in Spring Sharp. So they can't be simulated either. So this is where the Sorrel Souffle note-taking challenge comes in, because this is a lot of definitions. For semi-technical-ish words, belt armor is the bit that's labeled A on the rightmost image, and it protects the ships vertically from incoming shells, and is usually one of the thickest bits of armor on the ship. It protects the most critical parts of the ship, which are such as the boiler machinery, ammunition, powder. It can be an external belt, like on the diagram and the picture on the middle right of a King George V class battleship, where you see the big rectangle on the side there that's a dark gray. Or it can be an internal belt that is set somewhat inside of the hull of the ship. The main belts are very often declined, increasing the angle of impact with like this incoming shell. Here's the belt, like that. That the shell would hit with, which increases relative thickness because it forms a hypotenuse, and that's longer than any side. There are upper belts on many ships, which would be represented by the red line above the red line for A. Let's see, where am I? And end belts to protect the waterline ends from hits that may make holes that flood or slow down the ship and knock out steering. Armor decks protect the ship horizontally from incoming shells and bombs. Oftentimes the armor deck will literally just be the floor. If you've ever visited a museum ship, I have a picture from USS Massachusetts in the top right, where they've actually labeled how thick the armor plate is at a hatch. And a ship usually has a top armored deck that's thin, and then they have one or more much thicker armor plates below, which would be represented by B. There's also protected decks, which is what C shows, that have a sloped side behind the belt, which increases the horizontal armor protection of the ship. Since if a shell is falling towards a belt this way, if there's another thing behind it that it hits, that's more armor. And it's often called a turtleback deck. The protected deck is the standard until the 1910s or so for the most part, when after that point, most ships have armored decks, aside from a couple exceptions, like a lot of the German ships of the interwar and World War II period, like Bismarck and Scharnhorst. Torpedo protection is D on the diagram. Torpedo defense systems are a system of layered voids and fluid spaces that are designed to reduce the effects of an underwater explosion by dampening the blast effect and slowing or stopping metal fragments that would go through bulkheads and lead to flooding. There's also much simpler and less effective systems with a single void space, as well as on the middle left. Uh, the bizarre and complex Pugliese system dreamt up by an Italian engineer, which didn't work at all. It just kind of crumples. It sucks. That's what the little circles are on that diagram. Um, Torpedo protection is more effective the deeper it is, since it can have more layers and also more space that fragments aren't traveling through bulkheads with. Um, but it is limited by the amount of machinery and other stuff you have inside of the ship in the underwater sections. Um, Destroyers and light cruisers on the smaller end would have little to no armor and sometimes no torpedo protection either due to their dimensions and lightweight. Machinery refers to boilers, which boil water using coal and or oil, or diesel generators, and the turbines that the steam moves through pipes and then spins. It's like a miniature power plant, and historically some ships were used as power plants in times of emergencies for cities. I think USS Lexington or Saratoga was a power plant for either somewhere in Mexico or San Diego after a some sort of natural disaster or storm. Torpedoes are bombs on sticks. They used to literally be sticks with an explosive on the end, even on the ends of ships on the tip of the bow, called torpedo rams that would ram into a ship and then explode. But eventually someone had the bright idea to put a little engine on the end of one and have it move underwater, which makes them a very dangerous weapon since they can make a big boom that causes a lot of flooding. There's a picture of a torpedo being launched in the bottom left from USS Chicago, I think. Turrets are the mountings for naval. Oh, it zoomed in so much. Turrets are the mountings for naval artillery, though sometimes a mounting is a mounting and not a turret. Let's see, there we go. Two can be seen on the middle right image. There's a quadruple that's lower and a twin that's above it on the middle right, with a super firing turret, which means shooting over the other. The measurement in the next bullet. What? Why did I write that? Oh, okay. Bore diameter is measured. Wait. Okay, I think I know what I'm doing. Okay, I got lost here. Bore diameter is the width of the bore of a gun. So basically, the inside of the gun is yay. The circumference is like yay. So the bore is this wide. This is what the designation for a shell's width is. So if it's 250 millimeters, that means that the barrel of the gun is 250 millimeters wide on the inside. The caliber of the gun is how many of this long is it? So if a 5-inch 50 gun existed, it would be have a bore length of 250 inches or 20 feet 10 inches. And it's usually dictated in like measurements / number, which shows that. There are 4 main measurements of tonnage for warships. 2 matter for this panel. Normal tonnage, the measurement of a ship with a full crew and 2/3 supply of ammunition and other stores. The second, standard tonnage, was defined in the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty that imposed arms control measures limiting the total tonnage of fleets for the world powers and the sizes of ships. It is the ship fully loaded for battle, not counting fuel or feed water, which is the water that the ship's boilers boil. The bow is the front of the ship, and the stern is the back. Aft refers to the back half, and forwards refers to the front half. I don't think I mentioned either of them today, but port is left and starboard is right. My methodology of the 3 ships analyzed in this panel, 2 are examined at detail in Spring Sharp. The third is a destroyer, which cannot be accurately simulated, but is based off of a real ship from our real world. So most things about it work already anyway. Any ship I'm examining has to be fabricated at least in part or full by Wargaming. It can't be based off of a never-built design, though if the ship has 1 or 2 levels of extrapolation from such a design, I think it's still fine to criticize. The destroyer we'll be looking at breaks just a little bit, but it'll make sense. There are 0 fictitious submarines in World of Warships. All of them are real. Since aircraft carriers don't sim, I can't really evaluate one in the right way. There used to be an RTS system in World of Warships where like you had a bunch of flights of planes flying around, but they changed it till you control one flight of planes. I decided that I should be a little bit generous when I'm simulating ships in Spring Sharp, because in case the engine trouble is weird. Um, so I've omitted simulating end and upper belts, and I didn't really account for any plating, which is a game balancing feature in World of Warships that kind of interacts with armor penetration for HE and AP shells. Spring Sharp demands heights of armor belts and their lengths, based off of sections of the ship in percents, or sections of the ship in percents. And I got these by measuring the pixel length of each section in a screenshot and comparing it to the ship's length for the heights of decks. I simulated declined belts the true and correct way using cosine to find the hypotenuse instead of just using the pure vertical height. And a lot of the weapon info came from NavWeps, which is a really good website, and they have articles that are technical and very cool and fun. And I also looked at shiptool.st, which has stats that the WoW's wiki, which I also used, didn't have. And I also used the stat cards in game too. First ship. So the first ship of the day is the most recently added of the three. It just got added to the game within like the last month or two. I've only seen like one or two in games, and I have no idea how you're supposed to get it. But it's USS Hull, a Forrest Sherman class destroyer, which was built after the end of the Second World War. She was a real ship. There's 2 pictures of her at the bottom. But it's earned this spot on this list by being a really kind of silly extension of her historical career. The historic ship had one gun, the front one, swapped out for a much larger gun to test for future ships. And Wargaming decided, well, what if we had all 3 turrets switched out? Very strange. There's also a non-modified Forrest Sherman. The name ship is in the game too, and has been for some time. The reason that they replaced all 3 guns instead of just one is for gameplay reasons. If you have one controllable turret, they don't do mixed batteries in World of Warships. If you have one controllable turret, it kind of stinks. If you have 3, it's a lot better. So, during the 1960s, the U.S. Marine Corps wanted the Navy to have ships that can bombard beaches ahead of and during amphibious assaults. During this time, we were phasing out most of our ships with big guns left over from World War II, which left a really big gap in capability that the Marines really wanted because they felt like it helps them a lot when they're trying to get on beaches and get shot at. The short of it is that a bigger gun makes a bigger boom and can also pierce through a larger bunker over greater ranges. So the Navy developed the 8-inch 55 Mark 71 gun mount, meant for the larger and more accommodating destroyer classes of the future, like the Spruance and Arleigh Burke classes, that ultimately ended up receiving 5-inch guns instead of the USS Hull, which was selected as a test bed for the gun and mounting. The 5-inch mounting on Hull was switched for the 8-inch. The 2 pictures below illustrate the refit. Left is the pre-modification, and right is after the modification. The Navy ultimately canned the 8-inch gun project, leaving a capability gap that continues to this day, with a similar fate falling upon the guns of the Zumwalt-class destroyers now. As mentioned on the previous slides, destroyers can't be tested in Spring Sharp due to the missing machinery slider feature. However, I did perform a very small amount of testing just to see how one aspect of the ship was impacted, independent of Hull's simulatability. This slide has a lot of numbers on it, and there's math. The main point of contention of viability when it comes to WoW's Hull is how stability is affected by the addition of not small amounts of top weight on a pretty light ship. The barrel for the original 5-inch gun weighs just under 3 tons, a third of what the barrel for the 8-inch gun that was added weighs. The original 5-inch gun mounting weighs 72 tons with ammunition. Even with 0 rounds in the big cylinder-looking bit on the bottom, right, under the gun house, the 8-inch mounting weighs 122 tons. With a full load of ammunition in ready racks, this goes up by another 13 tons to 125 tons, which is 73% heavier just on a single mounting versus the original mounting, all of which is above the water line. I believe you can see it in there. It might be really thin line, but everything that has meaningful mass is above that line. In addition to weighing more, replacing any number of 5-inch mountings with 8-inch mountings requires strengthening the hull structurally to handle the weight. I don't have the exact figures for how much weight was added when they did this to hull, but if it's done 3 times instead of 1, that just adds even more top weight. A 106 or greater ton increase past what the hull has already gained is significant, as it has a standard tonnage of just 2,800 tons. There are actual cases in which warships had too much top weight and tragically rolled over in heavy seas due to a reduction in stability, most notably the Japanese Tomazuru incident that led to the Japanese Navy massively revising their design guidelines and modifying existing ships to prevent it from happening again. On top of that, the Tomazuru, Tomozuru. On top of that, the previous USS Hull sank during a typhoon because it had too much top weight and it rolled over. If Hull could handle the stresses of firing 1 8-inch gun in real life, it can probably handle firing 3, though probably not the best to do it all at once. It should probably still be fine in doing so, and the strengthening of the ship around the gun mountings helps with this a bunch. If it can't handle those stresses, it isn't like it would capsize from the gun firing. It would just have like cracks in the superstructure that are suboptimal. You don't want to have cracks in your metal and other wear. So the test I did for Hull in Spring Sharp was I made a ship with its dimensions in the tonnage section, and then I put engines in it and fuel in it to put weight down low. After which I used the miscellaneous weight feature to add the 2 weights of before and after the historical and WoW's modifications. For the historical ship with the 8-inch gun, it would be 269 tons in the above deck box, and it would be 375 in the above deck box for how it appears in World of Warships. The main thing that's affected by this that matters here for this measurement is the metacentric height of the ship, which is a weird physics number involving buoyancy and flotation that has implications for stability during the rolling that occurs when a ship is floating in the ocean or in a storm or anything else. A larger number means that it's more stable, but it rolls a little sharper. But that's not that bad. It's the Navy. They can handle it. The historical configuration has a metacentric height in Spring Sharp of 2.01 feet versus 1.82 of the in-game configuration, which shaves off 10%. I don't know how major that is, but it's not good. Neither number is likely to be super accurate, and it's probably not entirely disqualifying of the ship's viability. I imagine that the actual metacentric height in real life was higher than either of these, but it's important to look at still. The reason Wargaming changed Hull's armament was to use its interesting gun, but separate it from Forrest Sherman mechanically at the same tier in game. Since World of Warships does not use split controllable batteries at all, they go so far as to, for stat purposes, at the tier 3 in game, the battleship Kawaichi actually had guns of the same type, but 2 different lengths. To simplify the muzzle velocity issues that would occur from this, they just made them all mechanically the same. And I think they would have, that's obviously why they did that here. They'd never do split batteries in game. From a historical angle, this mounting wasn't meant to replace all the guns on a Forrest Sherman class destroyer. It was meant to be a mounting used on future cruisers and destroyers to increase their firepower and meet the needs of the Marine Corps. The Navy would not have made this change historically. Because of that, the single 8-inch gun Hull had during testing was eventually removed and replaced with the original 5-inch gun as well, after only carrying the 8-inch gun for about 5 years. I would say that as presented in World of Warships, Hull does work physically, but it would have some kind of stability concerns that I don't think I'd be very happy with. It can handle the extra weight for sure, just not in the way that's good. Overall, Hull is historically busted, but physically plausible. The second ship we have is the Tier 10 Italian cruiser Napoli, which is based off of how in the 1930s the Soviets collaborated with the Italians technically in order to build up naval expertise and knowledge so they could build up their own navy, which led to a number of projects based off of Italian designs, most of which were ultimately canceled on the Soviet end because Stalin was fickle and he needed tanks, so he couldn't build ships. Project 22 was for a large heavy cruiser weighing in at around 17,000 tons with 9 to 12 guns in the 250 millimeter range. There was a similar proposal that was very directly adapted into World of Warships, Project X, seen bottom right, in-game as Commissar on the bottom left. Napoli in World of Warships is based loosely off of Project 22, but is sort of its own thing, owing to an increased tonnage and being a lot more Italian than any Soviet designs were. Like using all Italian weapons, kind of. A very underutilized gameplay style in WoWs is secondary guns on cruisers. Since cruisers are a lot squishier than battleships, since they have less armor, it can be rough for players if they get in too close to their opponents. Despite this, Napoli's high secondary fire rate and damage per minute is very cool and swag, and is a great look into an underutilized design space in WoW's cruiser playstyles. Because Napoli is a rather large cruiser, it is relatively simple to simulate in Spring Sharp. The only real issues with simulating it involve the machinery slider issue, since it has a 35.5 knot top speed. That's like 43 miles an hour probably, which is very fast for a warship. And this issue even gives battleships problems sometimes too. But Napoli might be a heavy cruiser, but it fits better into the concept that the large cruiser, that the Alaska class, is the only historical ship that actually got built to that concept. It's more cruisery than a battle cruiser, but more battleshipy than a heavy cruiser. The blurb in-game, every ship has a little blurb that gives some historical info. The one for this does call it a battle cruiser, despite being only 22,000 tons standard, according to the actual design premises that the Soviets were given. I will say with certainty that the 22,000 tons thing does not work, and it is not with the weight that the ship is given in game at all. I gave the ship the same cruising range and speed at cruising as the Littorio class battleships, and because I knew it wouldn't work at 22,000 tons for sure, I went with the in-game files tonnage, which is possibly full tonnage, 26,892 tons. I could have also just, instead of changing its size, increased the amount of fuel it carried, but I can guarantee that it still wouldn't work even with that adjustment. Napoli's guns are entirely made up. They are 254 millimeter 60 caliber guns that Wargaming apparently based off of World War I era British guns of that size. This is a ship from 1936, according to the game. But it would have been it's kind of weird because they could have just came up with Italian design guns for that instead of using ones based off of British guns. Additionally, any World War I era naval gun is like a decade out of date since the design year for the ship is 1936. There isn't a reason why they didn't make up an Italian gun. And only one other ship in the game has that, which is the ship in the top right, Piedmont, which is a tech tree super ship, which is a ship above the top tier in-game. Piedmont is also meant to be a Project 22 ship at 22,000 tons standard, but it trades armor for higher speed, 37 knots versus Napoli's 35.5, and an additional turret. Whether it works is a whole separate issue that we're not going to cover today. I just am really weirded out by the guns just being what they are. The tertiary and anti-air guns are inaccurate for a 1936 ship. The 37 millimeter anti-air guns, which are these tiny little boxes that are interspersed all along the ship. There's 2 in front of the front turrets, and there's 2 behind the back turret, and there's a couple in other spots. It was found to be a failure before the time that this ship was meant to have been designed, so it doesn't make sense for it to be on there. And going forwards on pretty much any ship that they put the 37 millimeter guns on, they had an open twin mount instead of an enclosed boxy quad mount. The twin-mounted version of the tertiary 90mm guns, which are the guns that are very much in the middle part of the ship, are planned to have been designed later in the 1930s and were never actually put on a ship, which isn't a bad thing as far as inaccuracy on a made-up ship goes. But if they... in quantity, I think it's adequate, though I would have had like maybe one extra 90mm turret per side. It's likely that Napoli has a Pugliese torpedo defense system, which, as mentioned before, probably brings down the ship a lot quality-wise, but not for evaluation as whether or not it would have worked historically. It has a 220 millimeter external belt and an estimated 155 millimeters of total deck armor. It's kind of weird measuring deck armor in World of Warships because you can't see all 3 decks in the armor viewer. That's just under 8 inches and 6.1 inches, respectively. Or just under 9 inches and 6.1 inches, respectively. Which is a good level of armor for a ship like this. Historically, it doesn't make much sense for the Italians to build a ship in an Italian yard for the Soviets if it's meant for something that they're supposed to build themselves. If it's a design meant for the other Italian ship, like this Piedmont, specifies being built in Italy for the Soviets, even until the start of the Second World War, in which Italy would have finished it. But I don't think Italy would have built ships for the Soviets of this size, partly due to treaty reasons. Soviet negotiations with Britain regarding naval arms limitations in 1936, the year the ship is designed, according to the game, led to the canning of the Project 22 heavy cruiser design process. So by then, the ship would have likely been barely laid down, if at all, since it was meant to have been designed that year. Would this ship have the space in the Italian fleet despite this? Maybe. The Italians were cool with breaking the naval treaties that limited the size and number of ships, most egregiously with Zara and the Littorio class. But a large cruiser like this would be weird use of their battleship tonnage, since any ship with guns over 8 inches in in bore diameter and over 10,000 tons standard would count as battleship tonnage for their allotment and under the Washington Naval Treaty and the London Naval Treaty. At this point, like, it would just make sense to put out another battleship for the cost of 1 or 2 of these, given how Italy wasn't like super wealthy at the time and couldn't just afford to make as many ships as they wanted. It's totally kind of a design that the Italians would dream up and similar to the ones for the Soviets, but I just don't think it's something they would actually build in practice. While Napoli has a well-defined game role, I think that the focus on secondary gunfire is something that someone would not be able to immediately guess as a feature of this ship looking at it. You could easily remove the special stats and features in-game that make Napoli viable for the playstyle, and you wouldn't be able to tell at all that this was implemented for it. And it could just have been a normal cruiser in-game otherwise. It's more of like an afterthought design-wise than how it is actually meant to be in practice. Composite strength at the following tonnages standard is shown on the bottom right. 1.00 is the ideal for a ship, though I think that I should make some concessions for Spring Sharp being weird with the weight of machinery, if possible. The first is the listed 22,000 tons standard. The second is the number from the game files for standard, 26,892 tons. The third is what it has to be. Oh, I put the same screenshot in twice. My bad. The third one should be 1.00, which requires it to be at 36,229 tons standard, which is well past what either of its potential tonnages, 17 and 22K, are, and approaching, excuse me. What? Oh, I might have put the wrong number in. Maybe? I don't know. Approaching the tonnage of battleships like the Congo class and the trademark large cruiser, the Alaska class, historically is 29,771 tons standard. I think I might have switched those around. In actuality, I think that Napoli would have to be a similar tonnage to Alaska. It has a similar amount of armor, goes faster, but has lighter guns. But I think that it doesn't work super well at any of the listed tonnages. It's a huge hit towards its viability. It does work physically if you just make it much larger. But as presented, it's not really good physically and is questionable historically at best. Our third ship is the fictional Chilean battleship Libertad, which is from a line in WoWs of South American battleships built by other countries, namely Britain, that were then modernized in the United States during roughly like 1944. And their main hallmark feature is that each of them has 6 turrets with 2 guns each, and high-powered secondary guns, because it's the type of ship. A very popular playstyle in-game is secondary battery ships like the Napoli that was mentioned before, but especially for battleships, brawling, going close in and just kind of shredding guys with guns that you don't even have to aim is very popular in the game. The justification for the turret farm on Libertad is that there were various plans to purchase battleships with 5 to 7 turrets by various South American countries prior to the start of the First World War. One of these ships became HMS Agincourt after a series of failures for people to buy it, and the Turkish government no longer being able to purchase it due to being the enemy of the British in World War One. And the Rivadavia class bought by Argentina from America. During the 1900s and 1910s, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina were somewhat at arms with one another and began to pay other countries, namely the British and Americans, to build warships. And these fictional battleships are meant to represent what may have happened, have this arms race continued after World War I and into the 1920s. In-game, battleships get access to a skill that allows you to designate targets for secondary guns, which greatly increases their accuracy, something that Napoli does not get access to as a cruiser despite its secondary focus. Additionally, the South American battleships have an ability with a meter that fills when you get shot at or hit enemy players with your main guns. When filled, it can be activated to increase secondary gun range, fire rate, and damage for a short time. Due to its size and the fact that it's a battleship that doesn't go too fast, only 30 knots, it's rather straightforward to simulate in Spring Sharp. The little blurb the game gives for Libertad states that it received modernizations to its anti-aircraft battery in the United States in 1944, that it's much more likely it would have been built starting around 1921, given that the guns it carries were originally designed for never-built British battleships and battle cruisers of the period. Libertad is 295 meters, or 968 feet long, which is longer than the longest hallway in this convention center that you walk through to get here, which is the long hallway that leads to chip space. It is another 35 feet longer than that hallway. No battleship ever completed was this long. That hallway is 251 meters or 824 feet, according to Google Maps measurement tool. But if you walk all the way down that hallway, you can kind of visualize what it would be like to walk down the length of a ship this long. No battleship ever built was this long. With the longest were like 50 to 60 feet long, or shorter than this, which would be like Yamato and the Iowa class. The tonnage given for it in game is 63,000 tons, which means it's probably not a full weight. It's probably the standard weight of the ship or the normal weight. I went with normal because it's very round and it's well above treaty size. So I would assume it's not being measured at standard. The cruiser caliber secondary battery of Libertad is mainly meant for gameplay. Historically, it's a very questionable use of space and weight and is out of design practice. The ship already has 12 heavy guns. They're 419 millimeter guns for engaging ships that are at longer ranges. Considering the size of Libertad, which is higher than the American Iowa class and nearly as high as the planned Montana class, the heavy anti-air battery is severely lacking, with only 4 5-inch guns on each side, single-mounted. The main influences for Libertad are the Nelson-class battleships and the planned N3 and G3 class battleships and battlecruisers of the Royal Navy, which have an all-or-nothing armor scheme where the most important parts of the ships are heavily protected and extraneous parts are much less protected, maximizing survivability where it counts and saving weight. Libertad is very much a ship meant for having fun with a new styling of the very popular secondary battery playstyle in World of Warships, and its traits reflect that foremost. Those features are also the most notable ones: the size of its main battery and the visible presence of its secondary battery, which are the turrets that you can see all along the length of the side that are like a level below the main guns in the middle. The ship features an extremely thick, 16-inch thick declined main belt, and this belt is inside enough behind the 2-inch thick outer skin, which I didn't simulate because, again, I'm not simulating plating, that it may be considered a decapping belt, which is an experimental, especially in the 1920s, technique meant to reduce the armor penetration abilities of incoming shells. by the cap being smashed by hitting the first layer and then running into the belt, failing to penetrate further since its armor penetrating cap has already been damaged. By my estimate, as WoWs is somewhat unclear to when it comes to measuring, the total deck thickness of Libertad is roughly 6.5 inches, which is below average for a battleship of its size, but it's not disqualifying, it's just subpar. Torpedo protection on the ship appears to be at least 30 feet deep or more per side, which is the standard for a ship this large. Protection for the turrets is acceptable, though having 6 twin turrets instead of 4 triple turrets means a lot of weight is going towards the extra armor and additional barbettes, and also towards length. Libertad's anti-air battery consists of a total of 56 20mm Oerlikons machine guns and 48 40mm Bofors guns, which is a very adequate, perfect level of protection for a ship that would receive the refit in the United States in 1944. But having only 4 5-inch guns per side for anti-air is woefully inadequate for a battleship at that point in time. Additionally, the heavy weight of the secondary guns is detrimental towards the rest of the ship. The 20 234mm guns in their mountings and armor weighs as much as 3 or 4 of the main 419mm guns, or an equivalent mass in armor. The inclusion of these on the ship is a reference to the Lord Nelson class pre-dreadnought battleships of the United Kingdom, which had the exact same gun as a secondary gun, but much less. And that also kind of makes it a weird ahistorical feature that it has those guns as a ship from the 20s. Based off of testing in Spring Sharp, Libertad would need a minimum of 164,000 horsepower to make its speed of 30 knots at the tonnage the game says it has. In-game, the horsepower is 140,000, which isn't really that far off, so kind of kudos to them for getting it close. Historically, the ship couldn't exist, as the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 stopped the construction of all warships over 35,000 tons standard displacement in the UK and 4 other countries, which is where Libertad would have been built and is far over as presented in-game or in how much it would actually weigh if it were real. This is before considering the economic or political needs of the countries in South America changing. Most post-World War I plans were much more for fleets were much more focused on lighter ships like cruisers and destroyers instead of battleships that weigh more than the entire rest of their fleet combined. The whole South American battleship line is antithetical to British design practice in the early 1920s and onward, which created battleship designs with shortcuts like having all or nothing protection to save weight and costs. Also like HMS Nelson having all 3 turrets on the forward part of the ship, which simplifies the engine machinery arrangement and makes that weigh less as well. 6 turrets and large gaps between boiler rooms, like seen on Libertad. Note that one funnel is ahead of the 3rd turret and another is behind the 4th. So there can't be machinery in between, or there can't be boilers in between, because there would have to be another funnel in the middle. And all the smoke from the boilers comes out of those 2 funnels. So that would be kind of unreasonable for Britain at the time. It also does not work in Spring Sharp at the listed tonnage and with its in-game characteristics if it is at that tonnage. It would need to go up from 63,000 tons normal to around 84,800, which is a 33% increase in damage. It has 0.65 composite strength at 63,000 tons, which indicates that a lot of changes have to be made for the ship to work at that size, including a decrease in armor, armament, or speed to bring the ship back from being overweight, aside from if you don't want to make it larger. Most of these changes, if you did remove stuff from it to reach that goal of 1.00, would strip its entire in-game identity of being a secondary battery-oriented battleship, because that's probably the first thing I would cut if I wanted to save a bunch of weight. That it's physically impossible at its listed size is unfortunate, because I think it and the other 2 ships in its line are probably the most fun I've actually had playing the game. And if you get the chance to grind that far, you should definitely play them. You have to stomach a grind for a bunch of kind of middling light cruisers to get there, though. But it's worth it. Overall, I would say Libertad is kind of plausible only if you make it much heavier, and historically just does not work at all. And here I have a short list of book recommendations. I recommend you take a picture for sure here, um, to learn more on some of the topics I discussed today. Norman Friedman's books are very technical histories of the design process for ships, which is like my favorite thing. Very good books. They're kind of expensive, but worth reading. Very heavy. The most easy book to get into probably for naval history is The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James D. Hornfisher. It's a very easy read. It explains most of the stuff that you would need to learn about. It's a great narrative about the Battle off Samar. Um, Also recommend Gordon Pronge's At Dawn We Slept, which is a very thick, like this thick book about Pearl Harbor, what led up to it, and all of the legal battles that followed. There's like a whole bunch of legal battles where they're trying to see who's at fault for letting it happen in the U.S. Um, Also highly recommend the Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Fisher, there on the right, his memoirs. Um, he's one of my favorite people in history because he's a crazy person, and like he would go up to the king and like shake his fist in his face like Fred Flintstone, and got away with it. They would have to lie to him that ships are going as fast as he wants them to go, which is impossible for their technology at the time. They would just lie to him so he would be happy. He's awesome. Very funny person. They made political cartoons about him at the time because of how silly he was. Um, I'd also recommend Joseph F. Onwright's book Shinano, the sinking of Japan's secret super ship, written by the captain of the submarine that sunk her. I think that's the full subtitle. It's very tiny for me. And I'd also recommend David Evans and Mark Peaty's Kaigun, which is about the Japanese Navy and their fleet planning, and why they made ship design decisions they did and fleet decisions they did. Let's see how much time we got. A couple minutes. And that is all. Thank you for coming to my panel. It's a lot of stuff, so if you have any questions, please reach out to me at Sorrel Souffle, like anywhere. You can @ me on Twitter, or you can try to message me on Twitter if I notice it, and I'll try to answer the best I can. Please do what you can to learn more about ships, because they are epic and very swag. Thank you.